seventh grade. So today we're going to talk about the road to war, war being World War II. And there's going to be, because of Washington State history, a little more emphasis on the Japanese theater and then some of what was going on in Washington before the war actually started. So starting with some Japanese background, and I've actually talked about a few of these slides before when we first started talking about Hotel on the Corner, Bitter and Sweet. But 1853, Commodore Perry, who's from the United States, opens, quote unquote, Japan, basically allowing for trade to occur in Japan or outside of Japan, and also stopping things like shipwrecked sailors being executed. But it happens at the point of a gun, so they were called the black ships. They were painted black, and I actually found a Japanese representation of one here in the corner. And so, psychologically, it was this big thing, right? Where, Japan, who'd been kind of isolated and stood strong against so many invaders, to include the Mongols, was finally forced to do something. And so in 1868, they had the Meiji Restoration, with putting the Meiji Emperor on the throne and kind of starting this industrialization, becoming a power that could be equal to Europeans, United States, in terms of industrial output. And in 1877, there was a rebellion of samurai. Actually, Saigo Satsuma was involved in this rebellion, and that link leads you to a movie. For all its flaws, is an interesting representation of this rebellion, The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise. But anyway, we're not going to click on that link. But one of the things that remains after the samurai are defeated is this Bushido Code, this sort of idea of military prowess, martial prowess. And it leads directly to these next two bullets where both of these, wars were started without a declaration of war, a surprise attack, which you can probably see where I'm going with that, but we'll talk more about that later. So Treaty of Versailles, again, I'm going to talk a little bit about Germany in regards to World War II, but primarily focus on Japan. Japan did not have a big part in World War I, but what's interesting is they brought a request for an article to be entered into the Treaty of Versailles, which is the treaty that happens at the end of World War I, talking about racial equality. And it's turned down, and the Japanese obviously are not very happy about this. In terms of what Germany had to deal with, they had to pay modern equivalent of $500 trillion in war reparations, which is just simply, you fought the war, you lost, now you got to pay somebody. And they finally paid off all the interest on the bonds for this in 2010. So that's how, how much this was in terms of a blow to their economy. And then Article 231, Germany had to accept all the guilt for starting World War I. All right, so back to Japan. So I've shown you this map before, but it just kind of shows you Japanese imperial expansion, starting off with the island of Japan, and then eventually expanding into Manchukuo or Manchuria, China proper, and then on into French Indochina, and then eventually the Philippines and what was called the Dutch East Indies at the time. We know it today as Indonesia. So part of Japan's process of industrialization to make this empire expand was the Zaibatsu economy. We talked about this before, but it's these giant corporations that control a bunch of different things. They control banking, they control mining, they control shipping. In fact, the Mitsubishi, the symbol there, they started out as a shipping company and eventually were one of the #1 chemical industries. They also obviously built vehicles. Today, you probably know Mitsubishi cars, a lot of heavy equipment. And today, in a different form through some mergers and whatnot, it's also the largest bank in Japan today. These Zaibatsu came to prominence after World War I. They're owned by families, but they were supported by the states. In other words, the Japanese government made sure that these businesses not only survived, but thrived. And before World War II, there were 4 companies controlled a quarter of all banking, mining, chemical industries in Japan, and over half of the shipping, machinery production, and value of the stock exchange. So Japan keeps expanding. It's industrialized. It has equipment that's equal to, and in some cases better than, any European or United States equipment. And in September of 1931, there's the Mukden incident, and it's where the army actually acts completely independent of the government and creates this what they call casus belli, reason for war, which they created in the first place. Supposedly the railroad was blown up. Well, they actually did it. And they conquer all of Manchuria and set up a puppet government, Manchukuo. I didn't put it on here, but interestingly, in 1932, the Navy gets in on the military kind of running the government by assassinating the prime minister at the time. And then July 7th, 1937, Marco Polo Bridge incident leads to full-scale war against China. Again, a staged incident, a start to the war without a declaration of war, surprise attack, and arguably the true start of World War II, because this is, again, 2 years before Germany invades Poland. And these are main belligerents in the war, Japan and China. But for whatever reason, we call September 1st, 1939, or a lot of textbooks do, as the start of the war. So Nazi Germany, as I mentioned, they were crushed by these payments they had to make. The Great Depression affected them very heavily. They couldn't occupy their industrial lands, not so much that they couldn't produce there, but they couldn't put their armed forces there. They couldn't build their armed forces past a certain limit, which, considering all that happened in World War I and in hindsight about World War II, not necessarily a bad idea. But Hitler shows up, and he's promising to make Germany great again. And his first attempt is he tries to overthrow the government in 1923. It's really the local Munich government, and it's not well thought out, not well executed. Gets thrown in prison. He writes Mein Kampf, My Struggle, and he kind of writes about these ideas of like this military society. Definitely is very anti-Semitic, blaming the Jews for a lot of things that happened in Europe that were not good. And this idea of Lebensraum, living space. And Western Europe is pretty heavily occupied, pretty densely occupied. So this living space is going to be to the east, or the Soviet Union, which Hitler eventually invades. So this is kind of the pattern of German aggression. The Austrian Anschluss is when Austria is essentially annexed, brought into the German Empire in 1938, relatively peacefully. The Sudetenland is demanded from Czechoslovakia, and it's sort of this border region between Germany and Czechoslovakia. And it has a sizable German minority, but there was really no reason for it to happen other than the prime ministers of England and France wanted peace almost at all costs. So they agreed for this to be given up. But then Hitler, that's not enough, takes the rest of Czechoslovakia, actually takes the Czech Republic. Slovakia becomes an independent state that allies with him. Then he also takes Memel, which is part of Lithuania, in this continuing bid to grab land. Again, this Lebensraum, right? This living space. And so that kind of is all the lead up to World War II between Germany and Japan. Here in Washington State, talking about Japanese discrimination leading up to the war. Completely legal public organization called the Anti-Japanese League was formed in 1916 in Washington, and was very instrumental in passing some of these other laws. The first one being a statewide one, and the second one being a national one. But the Alien Land Law passed in Washington in 1921. I briefly talked about this before. It prevented any illegal aliens, so in other words, any immigrants, from buying or owning land. And the owning is important. So if you had immigrated from Japan in 1880, and you owned 100 acres and you've been farming it for 40 years, that land could and often was taken away from you. And some of the people that were in that situation tried to then give the land to their children, and then another law was passed to make sure they couldn't do that in 1923. And then there's the Immigration Act of 1924 stopped all immigration from Japan. So there was certainly anti-Japanese sentiment long before Japan was even remotely to be considered an enemy of the United States. And not as much of a bearing on the United States and Japan going to war, but definitely a bearing on the internment, which we read about in Hotel and Corner Bitter and Sweet, and which we will talk a little bit more about a little bit next week and more the following week. All right. It's been good talking to you, 7th grade. A couple of you were on Zoom today. That was fun to talk to you. And I'll be looking forward to your comments down below. All I want to know in your comments is, again, anything that you saw in this video that you're curious about, that you want to know more about, or if there's something I didn't talk about and you want to know, well, what about this in terms of the lead up to World War II? All right, you guys enjoy your day, and I will talk to you guys on Thursday.